Okay, good timing. I just see that the recording turned on. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to welcome you back to our Waypoint Talk series. My name is Christopher Canning, and I'm the Director of Research and Academics of the Waypoint Research Institute. It's my pleasure to be here today to introduce our new speaker for this Waypoint Talks, and we're really excited about this one. So, Brandon, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll say a few things, and I'll pass it over to you in a minute or two. So before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge that the Waypoint Research Institute is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, which includes the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, Huron, Wendat, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge and affirm our commitment to improving relationships between nations and to improving equity for Indigenous communities residing in the Central North region of Ontario. I would also like to invite you to share the traditional territory you're joining us from today. If you're not sure what that territory is, there's a website you can visit called native-land.ca, native-land.ca to learn more about where you're joining us from today. And if you do find that out, we would love to hear that in the chat. So please share that with us. Okay, a reminder that the Waypoint Talk series is a webinar series offered by the Waypoint Research Institute. This was running for many, many years. We took a pause over the pandemic, but it's now up and running. We've run a number of sessions this year to great success, and we're really glad to have it back up and running again. We also run a complimentary series called Building Your Research Toolkit, which we run from time to time to look at best practices in mental health research, quality improvement, and implementation science. And a couple of our presentations so far have been focused on that. I wanted to remind you that these events are open to anyone interested in research, learning about best evidence, clinical practice, innovation, implementation. So please share these opportunities wide, and we're really glad that you joined us here today. If this is your first time on a Zoom webinar, here are some housekeeping items, but I imagine this has become second nature to us in the virtual world these days. But we are on Zoom, so if you do have a question or something to add to the speaker, which will be facilitated later on and throughout, perhaps in some of the chat, please don't hesitate to add some comments or questions in the chat box or to use the Q&A function. Those will be enabled for you to use throughout. But as I said, there'll be time at the end for a facilitated discussion. You can bring your questions to Brandon at the end of the talk as well. So totally up to you. We'll have someone moderating the chat as we go along. As always, the recording and slides will be available on our website, so please don't hesitate to look back at those at our website for that, and past recordings are available as well. We like to learn from these events to improve what we do about how they flow, topics, anything. So we share a post survey, and we would really appreciate you filling that out and sending that back in when we're done. And if you're here as part of a professional development and would like a certificate of completion, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And that information will be shared by Christy and others at the end of the presentation as well. But most importantly, I'm really glad to welcome Brandon Sparks as our speaker today. It's really nice to meet you, Brandon. Brandon and I have never met until this virtual meeting here today. Dr. Sparks is a senior lecturer in forensic psychology at Kingston University, and he met one of our colleagues, Zoe Hilton, this last summer, and they had some conversations about shared research interests. So it's really great that you're joining us here today. His research focuses on the intersection of deviance and romantic relationships, with a recent focus on involuntary celibacy, or what we commonly hear in the media as incels, and technology-facilitated sexual violence. He has given many talks on incels for the International Association for the Treatment of Sexual Offenders and the International Forensic Psychiatry lecture series and Safer Society webinars. So it's a really great pleasure to have you here today, Dr. Sparks, and I look forward to the talk. Over to you, and we look forward to the chat at the end as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and apologies to folks in advance. I am a little under the weather, so hopefully my voice will hold out throughout this. Yes, I'm presenting from Southwest London, so don't have much of a land acknowledgement except to acknowledge that I am in the homeland of many of the individuals who exploited Canada's Indigenous people. So we'll keep that in mind. So yeah, really excited. Thank you, Chris and team for having me to discuss a bit of my incel research and others' incel research, and really just emphasizing why these people and why this population is worth talking about. So, in terms of an outline of what we'll cover today, we'll talk a little bit about the history of incels and their ideology. We'll talk about what goes on and what transpires in incel forums. Then we'll get into actual characteristics of incels, what we know and what we don't. And we'll close off with some considerations or some therapeutic considerations about, okay, what do we do now that we know everything that we know? What do we do if we encounter incels or suspected incels in sort of clinical practice? So in terms of the history of, well, I'll call it involuntary celibacy here, the term itself dates back further than a lot of us are aware. It actually dates back to the mid-1990s and began when a woman named Ilana was in her mid-20s. She was finishing up her undergrad degree at Carleton University. And up to that point, she hadn't really experienced a lot of the sort of traditional or classic sexual experiences that you may have in college. And she blamed this on her appearance and not a lack of trying. So she wanted to have those kind of classic experiences, but it wasn't happening for her. And she wanted a label to describe her experience because she found that a lot of the ones that were being used at the time, things like Lonely Virgin or something like that, were kind of seemed a little bit judgmental and maybe minimizing what she was experiencing. And ultimately, over time, she came up with this term of involuntary celibacy. And around that time, she began her website called the Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. And this forum had a lot of discussion forums. It had mailing lists, it had article sharing, it had resources. It was generally a positive place. It was open to all genders, and it was well moderated. So there wasn't a lot of room for hate speech or anything like that. And apparently, a couple actually met on this forum and ended up getting married. So it also served as maybe a little bit of a matchmaking service. But overall, the take home really of Alana's project was that it was a positive, supportive website, provided help to a group of individuals who may not have otherwise sought support through traditional means because they could be anonymous on there if they wanted. Ultimately, things worked out for Alana. She began dating and left it to others to moderate the website. We'll see what that fast forwarded into in a minute. But I also want to note that at the time that Alana was doing this, and others were engaging in the forum, there was no research on involuntary celibacy. And back in 1998, a member of an involuntary celibacy forum, I don't know if it was this one or if it was another one, actually reached out to Denise Donnelly, who'd done some work on celibacy in general. Um, to ask her if there was any research on this group, and they discovered through their correspondence that there was none. And this led to the first involuntary celibacy study published in 2001 that went pretty much unnoticed until the recent rise of modern day incels. So it's not pumping up that journal's impact factor because it's been about 20 years since it was published before it started really getting acknowledged. And from this study, there were some interesting things that really kind of map on to later incels. So first, what they found was that involuntary celibates tended to be in about the mid-20s to mid-30 age range, and they did not have much experience dating during their teenage years. And they classified involuntary celibacy in different ways. So some were lifetime virgins, some were individuals who have had sex at least one point in their life, but are going through a period of sort of, we'll say, prolonged involuntary celibacy. And what they found was that 90% of virgins and just over half of those latter group never went on a date as a teenager. So they've gone through those classic teenage years and they've never gone on a single date. And most of them have never kissed another person before. So even those that did go on a date, even those that have engaged in some sort of relations, they never went anything beyond sort of, traditional early stage romantic or sexual relations. Also, About 90% overall reported having shyness, and one-third felt that they were unable to relate to others socially. One person described themselves as, quote, a perpetual teenager in terms of relationship potential. So they feel that, they're unable to go and form these relationships. And what they found with this was that there was a bit of a gender divide, um, and that there were certainly, we'll say, traditional gender role beliefs among this group, particularly uh, with the men feeling like they had to go and pursue relationships, but they felt too shy to do so. Similar to Alana, who described herself as pudgy and having eczema and just generally not attractive, a lot of these individuals did have body image issues. About half of them did. Um, and there's some theorizing about how their lack of sexual experience uh, may contribute to that, right? They basically haven't had the opportunity to have had someone else maybe compliment them or their body in a sexual way. And lastly, there were concerns about feeling what they called off time, feeling that life has passed them by, that they haven't really been hitting these developmental milestones, right? Most people who wish to have a relationship, by their mid-20s or their mid-30s, they've had at least some sort of romantic or sexual experience. These individuals effectively had none or very, very little. They also felt that they were sort of in a fundamental sense different from their peers. One person kind of described that as a sense of immaturity and a lack of completion. They felt that the great divide between childhood and adulthood hasn't been leaped. So they don't feel that they're a part of sort of modern day society in a sense. They feel that they miss or are lacking that experience that makes them adults. So this was research that was done on early involuntary celibates among both men and women. Fast forward 20 odd years to today when we talk about modern inceldom. Traditionally, we still define this as, or say that remains as generally an online collection of individuals who struggle to form romantic or sexual interests, or sort of romantic or sexual bonds. But what we see that's different is that this is traditionally seen as being predominantly male. And the existence of what they call femcells or female involuntary celibates is sort of disputed territory. Obviously, the femcells and the women out there say that this exists, but some of the ideologies put forth by incels claim that femcells simply can't exist. The modern incels as well. So by and large, we probably haven't heard or hadn't heard back in the early 2000s much about incels, but the modern iteration we have heard about for two main reasons. One, there's a lot of controversial forum content, which we'll cover in a few slides. And also they have carried out some deadly attacks. We saw a few years ago in Toronto, Alec Manassian carried out the Toronto van attack. There's been some here in the UK. There's been plenty in the US, all kind of carried out by and large by self-identified incels or individuals who claim to be doing this on behalf of incels or have had some sort of interactions with or overlap with this group. So we've heard a lot about them through those means. And in terms of the forums, their promotion of what we call pill ideologies, this sort of incel-based worldview. So we'll get to these next. Incels adopt pill ideologies based on the 1999 movie The Matrix. And the idea was that Neo, the protagonist, is given an opportunity to take one of two pills. He can take a blue pill or he can take a red pill. And the idea is that the blue pill effectively allows you to continue through life. You're blissfully unaware of all the issues that are going on, but you basically remain somewhat happy because you are in a state of pleasurable ignorance. You also have the opportunity to take the red pill. And this supposedly makes you aware of a lot of life's cruel realities, all of the problems that are going on in the world. And it gives you a very rational, all-knowing perspective, but it's generally quite depressing. And incels claimed initially that they basically were red pilled, or they took the red pill, and that those who argue with them were blue pilled. So the major premise really is that incels are aware of the way that society works, and all of the rest of us simply aren't. We've sort of, to them, drunk the Kool-Aid, and we're just ignorant of everything that's going on. So they believe that they have sort of this special wisdom that we don't have, and they are trying to enlighten us, and that is kind of the not the purpose of their forums, but that is what's transpiring on the forums, is that they're sort of educating the masses. And the premise of this is that society is based on a looks-based hierarchy. And I've taken a graphic here from Bale and colleagues who've done some work with incel forums. And they have basically broken it into there are alphas at the top, there are betas, and then there are incels at the bottom. And we see just with the color choice, we've got male and females in both, but with incels, it is male only. So what they've done is they've created these caricatures of alpha males and females called Chads and Stacys. And these are what they see as the highly attractive, resourceful, and sought after men and women. And they believe that women only want Chads, whether they're Stacys or whether they're normies, they only want Chads, but they'll settle for beta men if they've got resources. But they will only do that until maybe a Chad becomes available. So their view is that effectively, women are quite shallow, they're manipulative, they don't necessarily form real emotional connections with men. They're there to exploit them and to move on to a better thing if it comes along. So not a very healthy view of, of gender and relationships. So knowing what we do about, okay, there's the red pill and there's the blue pill, and incels are aware of this and believe that society is based on a looks-based hierarchy. Okay, well, what are they going to do about it? So initially, they focused heavily on ascending. The idea was that you could game the system. So you're aware that everything is based on looks. Women don't care about personality according to sort of this worldview. So you could game the system by ascending. So incels and normies could move up the hierarchy by enhancing your appearance. And this led to sort of two incel-y terms we call looks maxing and gym maxing. So this was basically just referring to enhancing your physical appearance, especially for looks maxing your facial appearance. So there was lots of talk in the forums about having plastic surgery, doing certain jaw exercises that supposedly give you a squarer jaw because they believe that that's what women are looking for. Um, and this weird sort of pseudoscience-y concept called bone mashing, where you inflict damage on your face in the hopes that it will change your bone structure to look more masculine. Then we also have gym maxing, same concept, but this is enhancing your physical appearance through things like exercise and weightlifting. So again, there's more emphasis on losing weight because they think that women want a very muscular, shredded man and developing that muscular physique. A few kind of other things that they've been focused on as well in these is what they call a wrist cell. So they like to add whatever cell to whatever it is they're talking about, where they're concerned that their wrist size is holding them back from dating women because they believe that this is something that women, whether implicitly or explicitly, are evaluating in a potential mate. And there's also a huge emphasis on height. Many incels call themselves manlets, emphasizing their short stature and the belief that women do not want to be with short men. And there's all sorts of discussion about women not wanting to date men that are under, say, 5'10". So some of looks maxing as well, and the plastic surgery focuses on enhancing one's height. through having your femur and your tibia broken and stretched. So this has been a major focal point of incel forums. Ultimately, along came the black pill, um, effectively a more nihilistic version of the red pill, basically saying that self-improvement cannot help an incel actually move up the social ladder. Um, the idea is that basically once you're an incel, you're always an incel. It's a fixed status. There's nothing you can do about it. And in some surveys, upwards of 90% of incels report endorsing at least some element of the black pill, but it's not necessarily seen as a requirement to be an incel. So a sizable number do believe in this, but don't think it's necessarily um, a quality or a belief that has to be endorsed in order to be an incel. For what it's worth, incels that I've interacted with qualitatively, most of them haven't endorsed or fully endorsed the black pill, so there is a lot of variation there as well. Um, there's also a bit of incongruence here because these larger studies say that, okay, well, 90% of incels report endorsing the black pill, yet there's still a lot of discussion about looks maxing and gym maxing. So incels maybe, even though they may endorse this sort of nihilistic, nothing can change black pill, they still are hoping that there's something out there that they can do to basically better their fortunes. So why are incels so adamant that they are correct? One of the reasons is that some of their claims are supported by particularly evolutionary psychology studies, and they like to reference the academic literature that supports it. Maybe a bit pick and choosy, but they can at least say, well, look, there is scientific proof that what we're saying has some validity. So they reference the academic literature that supports some of their beliefs, and they've collated this on the Incel Wiki. There's a page called the Scientific Black Pill, and it's got all sorts of different categories you can see here on personality, mental health, race, looks, face, money, height, body, penis, voice, age, etc. All with listing several studies and giving sort of nice lay summaries of them, indicating that these are all important in mate selection. So this is largely, again, from evolutionary psychology research, which will do things like suggest that women prefer men who are more attractive or have more money. And of course, there are some kernels of truth here, right? Things like facial attractiveness would indeed make dating easier. But these are not the only things that women or anyone look for in a mate, but they don't really take that nuance into consideration. They take this as very much a black and white issue. Here, it's a study that said that women would prefer to date an attractive man over a less attractive man. Ergo, all women care about is men's attractiveness. Right, and I've got some examples here of studies that they've cited indicating that women are attracted to dark triad traits, so they're attracted to men who score more highly in psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. And they use that to sort of indicate that, see, women don't care about a guy being nice or kind or having other pro-social qualities. Other ones, such as women experience sexual disgust when even envisioning talking to an unattractive man, or that women prefer dominant, aggressive, or wide faces. So again, these are the kind of things that they're discussing and referencing. It's also important that to note that a lot of the ways that women are portrayed in incel forums, we incels didn't invent this, right? We can't credit them these views to incels. In a lot of ways, they reflect broader societal views toward women that we've either held historically or that we still hold in sort of contemporary society. Right? Basically, incels are not the first or will not be the last to view or frame women as sex objects. Right? There's been lots of research on marketing research, some of which has indicated that half of the depictions of women in advertisements position themselves as sex objects. This is also a big narrative in pornography research, right, where women are positioned as just recipients of sex or to be used for men's sexual pleasure. So if this is in fact something that incels endorse, this is also reflective of a broader societal view. We also have concepts of hostile and benevolent sexism, hostile, basically viewing women as incompetent or emotional or as manipulative, which we've seen in incel forums, or as women as delicate, pure, and in need of protection. There's also concepts regarding traditional gender roles, men as pursuer, men as earner, women's role is to be loyal and to be home, that we might see in some of the incel forums. Issues around sexual and dating scripts. So incels may overestimate how much sex non-incels are having because maybe they view or have maladaptive scripts regarding the way in which sexual intercourse takes place. I've seen there are the moderators of the main incel forum. They do have a Twitter account, and they post some stuff that is, we'll say, quite maybe a bit adversarial towards the concepts of things like consent. Um, and they view it as maybe something that's owed to them or obligated. Again, having some of these maladaptive sexual or dating scripts that are also present in the broader population. And just the last thing I want to highlight is on hegemonic masculinity, right? We see that incels in their sort of looks-based hierarchy in the black pill, they emphasize this sort of alpha or Chad ideal as basically a caveman with money, right? A very tall, muscular, strong, square jawline, facially aligned man that women all want to have sex with, and they tend to believe that 20% of men are basically the Chads are having 80% of the sex with women. So maybe also reflective of a sexual or dating script issue that they've got, but they also really seem to highly endorse these concepts of hegemonic masculinity. So getting into the incel forums themselves, I mentioned before they're quite notorious. They host a lot of misogynistic and xenophobic and hateful and violent content. But at the same time, researchers have found that 10% of users are responsible for a majority of hate speech. So there is, a small number of super users that are really spending a lot of time propagating this. Another analyses have found that the violence actually only makes up somewhere between 1% and 3% of the content, depending on the article you're looking at. So even though these are forums that um, have achieved a lot of notoriety, it doesn't actually make up a sizable proportion of the discussions. So the take-home message really is that there is simply a lot of content on these forums. And more inflammatory posts are also more likely to get picked up, right? A lot of the research that's been done on incel forums, because there's simply so much, the selection criteria they've used, which is valid, is to pick some of the more popular posts or the ones that have the most comments or traffic. And those are also generally going to be ones that are more inflammatory, right? They're probably not going to pick up some of the benign posts that are taking place. And what's interesting too, especially in light of the previous finding that about 10% of users seem to be responsible for a good chunk of the hate speech, in broader surveys of incels, only about 1 in 10 endorse perpetrators of sort of incel-based violence. So they asked about Elliot Rodger, Alec Manassian, and Chris Harper Mercer, three sort of high-profile incels who've carried out attacks over the past decade, and most of them do not endorse that. And in the incels that I've spoken with, they've been really upset with this because they feel that it's made being an incel much more stigmatizing. So we have these not so great forums and a lot of people in it, and there's a lot of content, but we don't really know what impact that has until quite recently. So at first glance, it can be really difficult to tell whether these forums make posters, and I'm referring to posters specifically here, um, more misogynistic or hateful, or if they were already this way. It's effectively a chicken and egg conundrum. And the reason I refer to posters specifically is because the research that we've looked at here is focused on posters, and there's a lot more incels who don't actually post anything on the forum. So there's a much wider audience than you can tell just from looking at the number of people who post. So in the first article that just came out last year, Stelelia and Mishra looked at over about 116,000 users of three different now defunct incel subreddits, our incel, our brain cell, and our incels without hate. And what they did was they looked at their engagement in other forums as well, both before and after they began engaging in the different incel forums. And what they found was that engagement in more hateful forums actually predated engagement on the incel subreddits. Um, so it seems like these are maybe attitudes that they brought with them rather than ones that were necessarily cultivated in the incel forums. And leading up to this, we also saw that there was a lot of engagement in advice-seeking forums. So they were posting in things like our relationships, our sex, our am I ugly, ask women, and ones on depression. And what's interesting is this actually aligns quite well with the incels I've interviewed who indicated that they joined or came across incel forums while seeking sort of advice for their situation. So effectively, they recognized that unlike their peers, they weren't having relationships, they weren't having sexual relationships. They felt that something was wrong with them, and they were searching online for more information. So in this case, maybe they were engaging at some of these forums, and ultimately they came across the concept of inceldom or incel forums. Another analysis that just came out about a month ago by DeRoos and colleagues found that some of the more prolific users of incels.is, which is the new forum, already have elevated levels of anger, sadness, and use of incel vocabulary at the time they actually join the forums. So she and her colleagues did a 12-week analysis of their users, looking and doing some textual analyses on expressions of anger, sadness, and incel vocabulary. What they found was that um, both anger and vocabulary use did increase a little bit after a few weeks, even though it was already kind of high, and then it plateaued. So it seemed like the people coming in already had a little bit of these issues. And what's important here is to account that these were heavy users. Um, and previous work has found, again, that about 10% of the users create about 50% of the content. So we're focused really on a very small subset in doing some of this research. So for some of the more intensive incels, if we want to call them that, they're already coming in with some of these issues around anger, and it seems to increase a little bit and then plateau. And again, keep in mind, this research is all focused on incels who publicly engage in incel forums. Most of the incels I've interviewed don't post, they just lurk. Many indicated to me that they actually try to actively avoid some of the hateful content on the websites, but sometimes that can be quite difficult. And this aligns with other research just on people's online engagements. Generally, lurkers outnumber posters by quite a sizable margin. So what do we know about incels more broadly? So the ones that aren't just posting, but they're at least willing to take part in studies. Often incels are characterized as generally white men who hold right-wing or extreme right-wing views. What we found, though, hasn't really aligned with that. And this is across numerous studies that myself and others have found. Generally, incels tend to be in their mid-20s, but it tends to range between sort of late teens to mid-30s. They are overwhelmingly heterosexual. There are some that are bisexual or homosexual, but by and large, very, very heterosexual group. And and somewhere a little over 1/3 to just under 1/2 across different studies um, identify as Black or Indigenous people of color. Really want to emphasize here, so first of all, that is sizably high. Also, most of the research that's been done has been taken from US and UK samples. So the possibility is that the numbers are actually much higher than this. There's lots of incel vocabulary on race. So they will use terms like rice cell and curry cell to refer to being Chinese or Indian, respectively, and how their race or ethnicity impacts dating. And as if you recall from talking about that scientific black pill page, there is research on the effect of race and how that impacts women's reception to men of different racial backgrounds. Also, we see that they tend to be politically diverse, and if anything, they actually skew a little bit to the left. Um, and some research by Costello and colleagues found that about 39% of incels reported to be right-leaning, but 45% identified as left-leaning, and 17% said that they were quite centrist. And others who have used Pew Research ideological consistency scales found that they were actually substantially left of center on questions regarding homosexuality, things like corporate profits and social benefits. So they actually tend to be more uh, socially liberal than we might first assume. We also know that they tend to have higher rates of NEET, which means not in education, employment, or training. So effectively, individuals who maybe only have a high school degree or have not finished high school or maybe began enrolling in college and dropped out, or who just are not currently employed. And they tend to be a little bit self-conscious of this as well because they're well aware that doesn't help them in terms uh, of dating, right? Because they do recognize that women don't always go for alphas; they'll go for men with resources. But if you aren't in education, employment, or training, it's going to be pretty difficult to provide those material things that they believe that women are after. One thing that's quite interesting about this group that's come up quite recently is the high prevalence of autism spectrum disorder among incels. About a quarter of incels report having autism symptoms, and I think about 1 in 10 have formal diagnoses of ASD, which is much higher than the general population. And some research that have looked at individuals who've carried out acts of incel violence has found that about half of them seem to have a prominent display of autism symptoms. Now, obviously, this is not to say that autism causes extremism or anything like that, but it can help us understand this population. And it's prevalent enough that incels have begun using the term Aspie to describe themselves or others who have or what they would call as Asperger's. So recent research has found that the relationship between, sorry, there is a belief that their autism spectrum disorder is linked to their inceldom. And I don't know why this is all in caps, but there is some research to indicate that yes, individuals with ASD do sometimes experience some additional barriers to dating. They might be more anxious about it. They might have difficulty socializing depending on where they are. So incels might not be entirely wrong. That may be an additional barrier for them. What's also kind of interesting is that ASD could also help explain why incels adhere to the black pill or the appeal of it. So recent research has found the relationship between autism spectrum disorder and dichotomous thinking is mediated by an intolerance of uncertainty. So maybe incels adopt a very black and white approach to understanding dating because uncertainty is overwhelming, right? Knowing that, hey, there's a possibility someone could be interested in me, there's a possibility that they aren't. and that's probably existing along some sort of spectrum. It might just be easier to come up with sort of black and white rules about why women in this case make dating decisions. We also see that ASD and some of the hallmarks are things like cognitive inflexibility. And we see this whenever someone points out a flaw in sort of the black pill, it's written off as what they call a cope, or they'll claim that the person is blue pilled. And in some of the incel subreddits that were taken down, um, there were actually rules around this where you weren't allowed to say, hey, I don't know, I've got a coworker, and he's, not a very attractive man, and he's happily married to an attractive woman. You weren't allowed to point out exceptions to the rule that could actually get you banned. So there was a huge intolerance for any criticism of the black pill. Um, and we've also seen ASD associated with fixated thinking. Uh, so one of the things that's come out is that incels really sort of overemphasize or overfocus on their singleness or their lack of sexual experience. And they start to get quite anxious about this and feel that even if they did maybe reach a point where they go on a date with someone and maybe it's going well, um, I don't have the experience to basically pull this off. She's going to find out I'm inexperienced or a virgin, and I'm not going to have the sexual know-how, and they're going to leave me. They also report things like, they go out to a restaurant and all they can focus on is counting sort of all the couples and focusing on the fact that they might be the only single person there, or assumed couples, I should say. Um, and that makes them self-conscious and in some instances not want to go out. So that might be an expression of their ASD. In terms of their mental health, what we've seen is that compared to non-incel men, we have high prevalence of depressive and anxious symptoms, and that by and large, these are large effects. And I've done a few studies on this. Sophia Moskalenko has, William Costello has. There's been quite a few people, and routinely this comes up quite a bit. And what's interesting was one of the studies that I did on this was actually during the pandemic, when we know that general population rates of depressive and anxious symptoms were higher, and incels still sort of maintained their lead, so to speak, in this. The effects in terms of standard deviations was just about the same as it was pre-pandemic. So incels, again, really, really high prevalence of these symptoms. And some have sort of classified them using different diagnostic tools, finding that just under 3/4 would be classified as severely or moderately depressed, and just a little bit less would be severely or moderately anxious. And this isn't surprising. If you go on the incel forums, you see this a lot. You talk to any incels, this comes up. But also in the network analysis of Reddit users we talked about previously that kind of looked at their behaviors over time, one cluster of subreddit incels were engaging with a lot of subreddits dedicated to mental health discussions. So I had r/depression as one of them, right? This was a big source of discussion before ever joining an incel forum. Other studies have found that about a quarter have some PTSD symptoms, and about half report suicidal ideations. And hopelessness is a major discussion topic on incel forums, enough that actually is getting picked up more and more in some of the analyses of incel forums. It's becoming prominent and popular enough that it's getting up there with some of these more inflammatory ones. Not mentioned here, but incels also have very low self-esteem, and they report that their self-esteem is more dependent on their relationship status than non-incel men. So their self-esteem is more impacted by the relationship status, and of course they are perpetually single, and that seems to be impacting their view of themselves. We'll try to keep my voice through the final 15 or so minutes of this. In terms of relational health, what we found again, repeatedly, was they have low levels of secure attachment and elevated levels of anxious and avoidant attachment. So in effect, their views of relationships is generally not very great. They don't have a lot of security in viewing sort of viewing relationships in a healthy way. And interestingly, across both incel studies where I've looked at this, um, attachment has been one of the sort of unique predictors of incel status. When you throw in depression and anxiety and self-esteem and all of these things into sort of a large regression equation and basically say, okay, what are some of the unique predictors? It both times attachment has come out as one of the few, if any, predictors of incel status, and it's quite effective at differentiating incels from non-incels. Also, given that incels are sort of steeped in an ideology that purports that women are basically manipulative and shallow, it's probably not surprising that they don't have healthy views or models of relationships. But again, we don't know that the black pill necessarily causes this, but it could explain how it started or why some incels are receptive to this. Maybe they come into it with low levels of secure attachment. They come across the black pill and they say, yes, this makes sense with sort of the way that I view relationships. We also see that they tend to have high ratings of loneliness and exclusion. They report feeling detached from broader society, that broader society doesn't care about them or the experiences, that they experience minimization and ridicule. Even though they might be relatively benign individuals, they don't find that people are very sympathetic toward them. And what's interesting is that there has been a history of exclusion by their peers. So, the incels, well, the focus obviously in terms of the title is about sex, right? It's literally in the title. One of the hallmarks seems to be that they experience broader social isolation and that they experience this over a long period of time. Um, and what we see is that this basically happens throughout adolescence. They might experience bullying at higher rates, and they certainly feel excluded from their peers, and that they're kind of excluded from broader society. So over a prolonged period of time, not just in terms of romantic relationships and they're missing out there, but from broader sort of social, peer, even same-sex friendships, they seem to be excluded. And again, that probably does not contribute to healthy views of working relationships. Not surprisingly, given that they experience loneliness and exclusion, is that they report less social support. So they don't feel that they can uh, rely on friends or family to support them through emotionally traumatic or troublesome experiences. Uh, so what happens is they may actually be missing a key buffer against the elevated rates of rejection they experience. So I did a study that looked at their experiences on dating apps. And what I found was that non-incel men claimed that they sort of matched with women on dating apps about 1/3 of the time. Incels only reported matching about 5% of the time. So there's a sizable difference there. Incels are experiencing greater rates of rejection, and they don't seem to have those social supports there to help buffer them against the adverse effects of that. And this is particularly troublesome because incels are more sensitive to rejection in general. So not just romantic rejection, but rejection or being let down by others close to them in life, friends and family. They're more sensitive to it. They're more emotionally responsive to this. And in terms of how they cope with rejection, analyses of incel forums have indicated that a lot of the coping strategies they use are solitary. So they do things like play video games alone, they go to the gym alone, they watch TV. And what I found in my research is that they also use or they're more likely to use what I would call problematic coping strategies to deal with rejection. So they just simply self-distract. They engage in behavioral disengagement. So they basically reduce their effort to deal with the stress, or they give up, or they engage in self-blame. And they're less likely to use some more adaptive coping strategies like seeking emotional support, which they maybe can't do because they don't have those social supports, and they're less likely to use things like positive reframing, right? I was rejected, or this date didn't go well, but it's an opportunity to learn about myself and maybe some things I can do better. They tend not to do that. We also see that in response to rejection, they engage in a lot more self-critical rumination, which might contribute to some of those depressive and anxious and self-esteem issues they've got. But what's interesting is they're actually less likely to externalize blame and blame it on women than non-incel men when they get rejected, which was kind of contrary to what I was expecting, and obviously contrary to sort of the archetypal incel that we think of. So this is obviously a fairly high needs group, yet only about half have engaged in therapy. Right, which for many of them might be sort of their only opportunity to discuss some of these things, right? They've got high rates of mental health symptomology, but they don't have those general social supports they can talk to. But of the half that have gone to therapy, only 6% said it made them feel better. Over twice as many said it made them feel worse. But of course, this was just a sort of a quick snapshot study that was done. It didn't really look into whether there was a difference of treatment approach, treatment modality, was it individual, was it group, what was the duration, did incels drop out early because they maybe expected that therapy would make them feel immediately better. We don't know. They didn't really measure that. So we don't know a lot about incels with therapy, but what we do know is that their experiences tend to not be very good. So one of the things that we really don't know so far is what effect the black pill actually has on incels. And as we'll speak to in a moment, how it impacts their expectations going into therapy. So adoption of the black pill generally is quite mixed. I mentioned before, incels that I've engaged with qualitatively, it's been quite low. Other surveys have been quite high. So where exactly it falls, we don't know, but there seems to be a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how much they adopt this. And as I mentioned before, those inflammatory posts do generate traffic. So incels are at the very least exposed to a lot of these ideas. So the question is, of course, even if you avoid it, how much does it actually permeate into your beliefs, right? So for instance, we live in a society that has lots of racial and gender biases, and we can do our best to be aware of them and to minimize them, but we can still be impacted by them, right? You don't have to be attending sort of white supremacist rallies to still be impacted by broader societal views toward different racial groups, right? We try to acknowledge it, we try to minimize it, but it's there. So incels are kind of operating in the same environment, right? There's this ideology that's out there. They try to avoid these posts, but some have even indicated that on bad days they sometimes do read them. So they do get exposed to them. So what impact does it have on those who adopt the belief? And is there sort of an additive effect on just being exposed to the belief? So we can ask these sort of questions in a general sense, but I'm also thinking about specifically how this may impact their interactions with mental health professionals. Right. So here, again, about half of incels have tried therapy. Some consider therapy a blue pill concept on one of the earlier subreddits that existed when I tried to recruit. There was a mention of therapy in one of my posts, and they had sort of an auto bot that would pop up calling therapy a blue pill concept and that incels shouldn't do it because it's useless. And it is important to note that in some surveys, 71% of incels viewed their circumstances as permanent. And certainly that's what the black pill endorses. So that might discourage therapy because why would you engage in therapy? It's not going to change your circumstance. We also know, again, most incels are exposed not only to nihilistic content, but very misogynistic and sexist content. But most mental health providers are women. So what kind of impact does the black pill have on things like therapeutic alliance? Are incels willing to work with and respect female mental health professionals? We don't really have an answer to that yet. Encouragingly, a lot of the qualitative work that's been done with incels has actually been done by female researchers, and that's been generally explicitly advertised, and lots of incels have been willing to engage with that, so that's promising. But we're probably not getting some of the more hardened incels that one might encounter in mental health settings, especially if they've been referred to through some sort of anti-terrorism initiative like Prevent here in the UK. So how does that impact the therapeutic alliance? And how does that influence therapeutic expectations, right? If you believe that the problem is women or the way that society is structured, what are your expectations of therapy? Are you actually basically torpedoing the mental health provider's efforts before you've even begun? We don't fully know what impact that has. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and discussion about this later, given the audience. But thankfully, Josephine Broyd and colleagues who were at Forensic Hospital here in the UK put together some treatment guidance for working with incels and have come up with a few recommendations. So the first focuses on empathy and validation of experience. And I say validation of experience, not validation of their worldviews. Obviously, those, if they endorse those, are troublesome and we need to combat them in some way. But validating their experience, hey, it sucks to feel rejected, it sucks to feel unwanted, and to have experienced that for a prolonged period of time. Right? One of the things that came up a lot in my interviews with incels is that they felt that the society doesn't care about them. And that when they would express their concerns or their frustrations to others, they felt that they were effectively minimized, or they would offer them advice that was like quite obvious, and they just felt it was a bit insulting. Like, well, obviously, of course, I tried this. Why would you think I wouldn't complain to you if I hadn't already tried X, Y, and Z? Um, or people would try maybe too hard to relate to it, who never really experienced that prolonged rejection, right? Most of us have experienced rejection of some sort. Maybe we've gone out or we've gone on a date and it hasn't maybe gone as well as we'd liked. And while that certainly gives us a little bit of empathy, and understanding, that is fundamentally different than experiencing this year over year over year over year over year. So incels can sometimes view just general advice giving, and this is in Broyd's recommendations as well, as insulting or minimizing. So really make it clear that you value their experience, and that you do feel empathy for them. Just as, as human beings, regardless of where they fall on the ideological spectrum. Some of the suggested therapeutic approaches concern things like existential therapy and narrative therapy, person-centered therapy, and reality therapy. You could argue that incels do experience a bit of an existential crisis, right? They're hitting their mid-20s, their mid-30s, and sort of like the involuntary celibates back from the research 20 years ago, they feel that they're not keeping up with their peers, and that they're sort of falling behind. And that can be a bit problematic, and it makes them kind of feel or have this sort of identity crisis. Same thing, narrative therapy could be quite beneficial, given sort of the long-standing experiences they've had of rejection and how that might impact their view of healthy relationships. So narrative therapy could be effective. But the recommendation is to use CBT, or at least CBT in conjunction with some of these others, because it can help address some of those maladaptive thinking patterns, such as irrational thinking and catastrophizing, and promote cognitive reframing, right? It can help incels find alternative ways of understanding the world. And of course, if they do endorse some of those ideologies, or they've at least been influenced by it, it can really help combat those and help them have a much more pro-social view of themselves and others. So that concludes the presentation. Exactly an hour, so that works out quite well. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll open the floor for questions. And we'll give my voice a
Okay.
break.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was super informative, and I can say it definitely dispelled a lot of the beliefs that I previously had about incels. So thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I hope the audience did too. Um, Welcome everyone to the Q&A portion. My name is Christy. I am the Knowledge Translation and Implementation Coordinator with the Waypoint Research Institute, and we're very happy that you joined us this morning. So there's a few comments in the chat, and I'd like to encourage folks to use the Q&A function so we can sort through any questions that you might have for Brandon. Just wanted to pass along, Brandon, some comments about how informative the presentation has been, and also a comment that schema-focused cognitive therapy may also be a good match.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just some comments this has been very informative, and another comment that schema-focused cognitive therapy may also be a
Mm.
good match for these folks.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I don't know as much about schema focus, but from my lay understanding, yeah. I mean, this is again what I really want to reiterate with all this is not just the heterogeneity, but sort of the complex weave of sort of issues that a lot of them present with. And there's probably not going to be like anything, one perfect therapeutic approach. But I think, yeah, the more diversity we bring into this, um, probably the more helpful it's going to be.
Thank you. So I'm sure you can also see the questions coming in. There's quite a bit, which is great. Maybe we'll start with a simple one. So do you mind repeating the name of the author of the UK studies?
Um, which one? There were a few that I mentioned. So one of them was Melissa DeRoos and colleagues. Um, oh, but actually, I was gonna say she did this in the UK, but she's now in the Netherlands. I'm now based in the UK. William Costello was based in the UK when he did some of his, but he's now in Texas. So it seems like everyone moves around because I was in Canada when I did some of the incel research. So we all um, move around. I think when I talk about UK studies, we're talking about where the samples were, not where the researchers were. Um, and it just seems to happen that most of the survey-based incels tend to come from the UK or the US. Not sure if that's simply because of the forums that we're recruiting from, or if they're just going to be more prominent in those populations. I'm not entirely sure. But most of the survey-based quantitative studies have focused a bit more or had more representation from the US and the UK.
Thank you so much. That actually leads nicely into another question, whether incels are predominantly found in Western societies.
Yeah, I get that one a lot, and we really don't fully know because most of the people who are first off studying incels are doing it from Canada, the US, the UK. And for instance, when I did my qualitative study and I posted it, I posted it, I don't know, midday in UK time, and immediately, um, I had 50 people sign up and I could only interview 12. And this was obviously a good time for individuals in the UK, but could have been, the middle of the night for people in, Southeast Asia or something like that. So that can be an issue. I know others who have kind of posted at different times and they have had incels basically all around the world. Um, again, the fact they've got terminology for incels from China and India does indicate that there probably is um, some that exist there. Whether or not they call themselves that because they're, a Chinese American or Indian British or something like that, it is kind of hard to tell. But we don't really know enough about incels to say that they're predominantly Western societies, but that's where the research has generally focused.
Thank you. A question about some advice for screening for incel label or incel behavior and ways to present therapy in a way that isn't adversarial?
There hasn't been a lot in terms of risk assessment. The guidance from Josephine Broyd and colleagues, I'm wondering, it's still showing my PowerPoint, right?
Yes.
I can sneak away and pull this up.
Yeah.
Trying to remember what they called it in Josephine's study. There is sort of, but it's also an invalidated, so that becomes a bit of an issue. Oops. Um, measure of potential incel radicalization. One of the issues is that I did a review article on incels, and the editors asked me, can you tie this more into some risk assessments and theories of violence? And I looked up some models of general sexual aggression and lone wolf terrorism. And the issue with those models is that it would basically categorize all incels as high risk, because they all tend to, you know, experience feelings of hopelessness, have, depressive or anxious symptoms, to feel like they're not very well tied in with broader society and lack sort of those social presences that might counteract some of their ideologies, that they either endorse or are exposed to. So it becomes quite difficult. I'm just trying to find. Yes, there is Van Brunt and Taylor's Incel Indoctrination Rubric, from 2021, that has 20 risk factors indicating an individual's commitment to the movement. But there hasn't been any validation of that. So, keep that in mind. Maybe it's a helpful tool for you, but keep in mind that there's no real validation of that. They just kind of effectively come up with that based on their understanding of incels, probably more heavily informed by what's taking place in the forums. So yeah, that makes it quite difficult, in terms of, is this incel at risk? And here in the UK, the government's anti-terrorism initiative, Prevent, um, asks school teachers particularly to refer any confirmed or suspected incels to the Prevent initiative. So suddenly you have maybe a bit of a socially awkward kid being referred to an anti-terrorism initiative, and they're being assessed clinically. How effective is that? Is that person really at risk whatsoever? Are you making the situation worse? Because now maybe they had a good relationship with that teacher and now they don't because they know they've been referred. And if they're not using validated measures for working with them, that can create issues. So, this research is still really quite in its infancy. And with so few incels actually carrying out violence, which is great, it also makes it very difficult to validate measures in the traditional sense.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And Dr. Hilton, I hope that answers your question as well. Maybe tie some of your question into some of the others we have here. There's a great one about how you would recommend approaching the beginning steps of therapy as women if there can be a bias towards women, and so if someone's guard is already up as they enter therapy.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one advantage is I think we're probably maybe a little safe in assuming that the more radicalized incels are not going to at least seek out treatment from a female provider. So they'll solve that problem for you. But if it's someone that you are forced to work with through your work, or there's been a referral, I think the biggest thing is just to be aware of what, you know, if you're having a difficulty with them maybe engaging with you, reflecting on, is this basically because I am a woman and they view me as part of the problem? A lot of the incels I spoke to have not really felt that this was a problem. They don't generally blame women, and they actually appreciate that women, um, contrary to kind of some of the stuff that takes place on the forums, that they actually have more sexual freedom than they had in the past, which I was a little bit surprised to hear. But their rebuttal to that was, well, we want to be with a woman because she wants to be with us, not because she's been forced or, because they had to pick a husband because, they can't work and they need, someone to provide for them. We want a woman to be with us because they have genuine feelings for us, which was really interesting. But I'm going adjacent to your point. I mean, it might be worth, depending on your therapeutic style, maybe full on addressing that. You know, I think one of the things is the person you're working with, if they've explicitly identified themselves as an incel, or you're just suspecting, or they've been referred as a suspected one, that might also implicate or navigate how you might go about that, whether it's directly or indirectly. Um, I would say keep in mind that even if they haven't really drunk the Kool-Aid, they might be wary of things like feminism, or those terms, even though a lot of them actually do fall more left on the social spectrum. They might be a bit defensive about hearing things about toxic masculinity. So maybe just maybe the terms that you use, maybe be wary about their use and how they might be interpreted. I would guess that realistically, most of them are probably going to be in agreement with you on a lot of things. It's all going to depend on how it's packaged. One thing I think that one of the incels said to me was that I think we would have solved most incels' problems if people would just acknowledge, the validity of their experience. Because I think they get tired of hearing things like looks don't matter in dating. Because sure, of course they do. It's not the only thing that matters. And certainly there's lots of, I'm sure he's not one of the 51 participants, but people like Danny DeVito, who notoriously not, the Ryan Goslings of the world, has had meaningful relationships, and both romantically and platonically. But those things do matter, to some extent, and certainly life can be easier, and dating can be easier. So rather than just kind of blanketly dismissing some of their claims, acknowledge that, yeah, you know what, these things can factor in, but they're not the only things that factor in. And meeting them where they're at, because again, a lot of their ideologies and their beliefs stem from maybe a slightly rational place, and they've kind of exponentiated to become bigger, right? Most people do factor in attractiveness, to some extent, in choosing who they may date long term or short term. But again, they've taken that and said that's the only thing. So you need to focus more on getting rid of that notion that it's the only thing, rather than just dismissing it entirely, because they might be a bit, especially if you're a female, they might, you know, they might just not be very receptive to that. I'm sorry that doesn't like directly answer your question, but that's, as a non-clinician, that's the best I can do.
Very informative. Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple questions because we have so many great ones. So there's a couple questions asking about, has anyone looked into adverse childhood events, and then also the association of incels with personality disorders?
I don't think anyone's looked into adverse childhood events. I've heard some stuff around that. And some of the incels I've spoken to have, again, they talk more about bullying, rather than issues in terms of like their home life. So I don't fully know. If you read some of the individuals who have come out with, manifestos like Elliot Rodger, he mentions like parents' divorce and some issues around that. I don't know how much would come up on like if you're using something like the ACE, if he would have scored necessarily highly. Other incels have told me, again, there's such a broad spectrum, right? That there haven't been a whole lot of issues outside of bullying as a kid. So I mean, that's really the extent that we can speak to this. Um, I would say if I had to take a guess, maybe slightly more than average, maybe not an extreme, maybe not the same sizable gap we see between like incels and non-incels in terms of mental health symptomology, but maybe, maybe there are maybe one or two more adverse experiences in there. And then nothing to my knowledge on personality disorders. Again, I could see how maybe some of these traits or characteristics might map onto some, but I don't think there's been any, and no one's asked them about having been diagnosed with a personality disorder.
Cute. There's a really great question about if there's any kind of significance with religious affiliation among incels. The person writing the question sees a lot of similarities with those that adhere to biblical patriarchy or headship theology.
Yeah, I read that one and I was like quite interested. I've seen, I mean, again, there's not much research around it, but I have seen, reference to religion more than once. And I don't remember what study it was. Actually asked some questions just, in terms of demographics about religion, and, you know, a, a sizable minority held some sort of religious affiliation. Um, which is interesting given that, the black pill is very nihilistic, and generally religion tries to offer us a little bit of hope. That there's sort of like some higher power and there's order to the chaos um, that we experience in life. Um, I'm not too familiar with things like headship theology. Some of the, I think maybe, I don't know, one or two of the incels that I interviewed made some sort of explicit reference to God. So there clearly is some there. And maybe that's something they've always been involved in. Maybe that is something that they've adopted sort of along the way of maybe trying to help make meaning of their life. Because again, a lot of the discovery of inceldom has revolved around trying to make sense of the world and what is wrong with them. So it's difficult. Actually, I think religion is was one of the coping mechanisms I looked at, and there were no differences between incels and non-incels. Um, so there might be maybe a um, similar proportion of incels that have sort of religious affiliations as the general population.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about how incels view sex workers from their ideological perspective.
Ooh. Um, Sorry, can you say that again? I started thinking and then I stopped.
Absolutely. Just the view of sex workers from the
Sex
incel,
workers.
yeah, perspective.
Um, I don't know about sex workers per se, but on a lot of those social issues, incels do score more toward the left. So I would say they would probably be more open, and less judgmental of that. Sex work comes up a lot in incel forums, not in terms of a judging women perspective, but as oh, well, is this a solution to inceldom, right? Well, you all probably have enough money to go hire a sex worker, and maybe, you could work on your skills there, or at least you could, use that as sort of a release valve for whatever built up sexual frustrations you have. But a lot of incels don't really feel that that doesn't count, because there isn't the emotional intimacy there as well. And that someone's basically doing this out of financial obligation or because it's their job rather than something they want to do. Um, Again, most of the incels that I've spoken with have fairly, sexually liberal views about women. And that they should have the choice of what to do with their body. So again, kind of promising. I don't know what proportion that is, but at least that there is a sizable proportion of incels that have more liberal views about that.
I'm going to do my best to combine the last few questions so we can get to everything. So Glenn has a great question that I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about. He often hears about the swipe left, swipe right, and that it's all about shallow observations of physical traits. So he's curious about your thoughts on the apps and their contribution. And then to tie that together with Sharon's question, are there any other cultural milestones that may have impacted this development of the incel label and culture?
Yeah. So Glenn, your question is actually basically that was the premise of my first incel study. I was curious, we basically saw a rise of sort of the modern day incels. At the same time, we saw dating apps taking off. And well, dating apps are really efficient in that, like, you can go on and you can be, if I downloaded Tinder now and, London, there would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of potential mates out there. That, I can meet a lot more effectively than if I could, if I had to go meet them organically. But the price of that is that people have to evaluate potential mates very quickly. If you spent, several minutes looking at each person and their photos and reading their bios and maybe even trying to creep them on social media to really get to know them, that takes a ton of time and it takes a ton of cognitive resources. And the research on this is effectively that we try to come up with shortcuts um, to minimize the cognitive burden. And that usually results in us relying more heavily on physical traits because it's pretty easy to look at a picture and say this person's like attractive or this person isn't attractive or this person's really attractive and this person's only moderately attractive, more so than maybe trying to read their bio and, is this person funny? All of those things that generally take a bit longer. So yes, it can result not just in women, but in men as well, being more shallow because they're trying to preserve that cognitive energy and going through that. So yes, and that was exactly my thinking was that maybe this is exacerbating the issue, right? Maybe incels aren't as ugly as they say they are. They might just be slightly less attractive than average. But just because they're constantly being compared to, the guy before them, right, it might make it more difficult for them to do well and to get matches. So yeah, I wondered about their contribution. I obviously can't draw a complete connection there, but that was effectively um, my thinking as well. Is this basically just a byproduct of you're being rejected by a lot of people and you're aware of it because you're not matching with the person that you swiped right on to indicate you were interested. So maybe that's why we're seeing more incels. For Sharon's question, yeah, so, and this also kind of maps onto the ideas of emerging adulthood, right? In that, the milestones in which we kind of identify people as being adults are being stretched out as, more and more people are pursuing post-secondary education and jobs are requiring more education. The economy is not doing well, so it's taking longer to own a home. People are having kids at later ages. But we're still kind of comparing that to the norms from 50 or even 100 years ago. So I think a lot of people might be feeling that disconnect. And certainly, as someone who went and got their PhD, I certainly experienced those disconnects when, you see on Facebook that someone when you went to high school with, now they're 3 or 4 years into their career, they have a home, they've got kids, and you don't. And so for incels, we kind of see that as well, right? We see that predominantly they're not in education, employment, or training. So they're not only hitting those sort of relational milestones, a lot of them still live at home, in their mid to late 20s. And it's not because they're, in school or anything like that. They might be unemployed or working sort of an entry-level career that they're not particularly proud of or derive a lot of meaning from. So they're not hitting those cultural milestones of not only relationship, but owning a home, pursuing a career, and having children. And a number of incels I spoke to do want children. Some even are looking into adoption because they actually don't want to be reliant or dependent on a partner for this. And they do want to hit that cultural milestone of having a kid, having a meaningful career, owning their own home, etc. So I think one of the issues with incels that we kind of miss is that they're basically missing a lot of the cultural milestones that we define adulthood as. And that all compounds. So it's not just the lack of relationship, but hey, I've got a nice car and a nice home and I've got a meaningful career. It's they're missing all of these things that really makes them feel like they can't relate socially to others.
Well, thank you. I think we have time to sort of combine the last few questions. So if you know of any strategies that are supportive of helping young men that are vulnerable to the incel ideology, and then maybe some other additional resources or tools that the average mental health worker can use to understand what really is I'm learning today is a complex culture that has a lot of terms and nuances and all those sorts of things that the average person likely doesn't know about. So resources for young men who may identify as incels or lean towards that culture, and then for mental health workers who are trying to support these folks as well.
Sure. And I wish I knew some strategies that are effective. I don't. And what this becomes one of the issues with incels is that a lot of the incel forums have been taken down that were on Reddit, and that just pushes them to either a self-moderated website like incels.is, or they go to other forums that host a lot of even more notorious content like 4chan and 8chan. So it pushes them basically further underground. And it creates spaces where, a lot of the incels that I spoke to said the only place we really feel like we could talk about or post about our issues are on these forums. These forums also have a lot of content that they don't agree with and that they don't like to associate with, but they feel it's the only space that they have. So I think as a society, we need to be finding safe spaces for them to talk about these difficulties without being exposed to some of the more harmful ideologies. And there is a subreddit called Incel Exit for incels that no longer want to be incels. And it's not, just help me exit being an incel by helping me have sex. It's more about I want to get out of that community. And basically, it is a collection of individuals, incels and non, who want to support them in that journey and will offer a more empathetic ear. And it's also a place where some incels can sort of share their success stories of, hey, after however long, I finally found a partner, or, I had sex and I got sort of that monkey off my back. So it's also an opportunity for them to be exposed to alternative viewpoints of the world, right? Which you don't get in those incel forums because they're black pill heavy. And some of them basically forbid you talking about anything but that, or sort of any counter narratives. So, they exist in an echo chamber. So we need to be finding spaces where they can express some of these things, not in an echo chamber. So I don't have any resources. That one subreddit, there might be some others. I guess there was another one that some of them talked to me about called Purple Pill Debate. So it's supposed to be like a mixture of people from, the blue pill camp and the red pill camp to discuss things. And they found that to be quite helpful in challenging some of their beliefs. So there are some online communities, but there's not really dedicated in like a lot of dedicated incel places or supports. For the next one about how can I brush up on evolutionary psychology? It's not my forte either. I Again, if there's any evolutionary psychologists in the group, they might take offense to this. I tend to view a lot of evolutionary psychology research as very reductionist and a very simplified view of the way the world works. So, I think we can all understand that basic things as, people do value looks and material wealth in dating. That seems kind of like just an obvious thing. And of course, that's like a big thing in evolutionary psychology. So those kind of kernels of truth that, yes, they do exist, and you probably wouldn't really necessarily need a huge background in evolutionary psychology to appreciate or to acknowledge. And I think that's really all they're looking for is that, yes, these things do matter. Again, they aren't the only things that matter, and it's not just women that may care about these things. Um, I would even say for, if you really want to educate incels, you need to think about the way that research is conducted, right? And the way that evolutionary psychology research is conducted. So one of the studies that they cite about how women prefer like men with material wealth, they randomly assigned women to one of two conditions where they viewed a picture of a man, kind of very average looking man, and they manipulated the background to be kind of like a standard style apartment or like a luxury apartment. And what they found was that, keeping all else equal, women rated the man in the um, more luxury apartment as like more dateable or more attractive by like, a slight margin, but, it wasn't, enough to be attributed by chance. Um, so, okay, you know, what's the ecological validity of this? How much of an impact does that actually have on women's dating decisions in real life? Probably not a ton. Um, because women aren't evaluating one trait at a time, right? No one is. In making decisions about who you might date. There's a constellation of things, and it's not always coming at you in that sort of black and white way. So even if you're not an evolutionary psych uh, person, um, you can acknowledge just from your own experience, um, what might have a little bit of a kernel of truth to it. And if they are relying on evolutionary psychology studies, you can talk about how well those actually apply in the real world. Um, and, help them challenge, right? Develop that lovely sort of social science undergraduate education where we teach them to be critical of research and the way it's conducted, um, to kind of approach it from that angle of, yeah, they found this, but how big of an impact does it have? Um, yeah, I guess that's the best way I can answer that.
Great, thank you so much. And we are getting closer, just a little bit past our time here. So I'm going to thank everyone for their questions, and apologies if we weren't able to get to all of them, but I encourage you to reach out to Dr. Sparks if you have any additional questions. I'm going to briefly just share a closing slide if that's all right, Brandon.
Yes, sorry, I'll stop my sharing.
That's all right, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much everyone for attending, and thank you, Dr. Sparks. This was such an interesting presentation. I think I can speak for the audience to say that we all learned a lot. And thank you to our audience for some wonderful questions today. This was a really great Q&A portion. So just a couple quick reminders, please complete our post-event survey. We really appreciate your feedback to help inform our future Waypoint Talks events. And I'm going to send this in the chat as well, but if you would like a professional development certificate for attending this session, please reach out to me via email. My email is in the chat and on the screen there. And with that, thank you so much, everyone. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Can I answer the last question in there? Just
Sure.
while we're shutting
Yeah,
down,
sounds
about
good.
combat feelings of loneliness, inadequacy, etc. Previously you might have had things like church group or community dances. Um, that is something that some incels talk to me about, because I did ask them, do you have other sort of community, right? We talked about family, we talked about the online community. What else do you have going on? Some of them had nothing. Others did have sort of interest groups. One of them talked about how he plays, I don't know, some sort of online game. Um, and he and a bunch of the friends that he's made through there actually like got together in Poland for some sort of convention about it, and how it was like some of the most meaningful interaction he's had with people in quite some time. So I think it is important to try to get them engaging in something that's not necessarily incel related, um, where they can just explore other interests, right? And maybe this is an issue where we see that they aren't in education, right? So they're not going to university and meeting a bunch of new people and making a lot of friends. Um, a lot of them do describe themselves as being introverted, and maybe that has something to do with issues with social skills. Maybe they are just an introverted person, um, which obviously makes it very difficult for them to go out and make friends. Um, but yeah, those kind of community groups or online groups, um, or friends they make through employment or school are really important, especially for them, and having people to kind of counter the narratives they experience online. But, you know, we can encourage them to try to find those interest groups, but they might be a little bit reluctant or a bit shy to do it.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.